2-year-old because she was just
Very good. some further discussion. The item is a text amendment that was being taken through the process that involves about 8 or 9 different sections of the code. As a point of background, just to remind everyone where we have been so far, in the end of April, staff did bring to committee, per request, some items related to the definition of lot. There was a bunch of discussion, and at that committee meeting, it was deferred to the May committee meeting, and we were asked to review 4 other categories in addition to those definitions regarding a lot. That was the frontage, some other items regarding lots, the flexibility of the townhouse and where the front is, as well as some information regarding driveway length. At that May meeting, just because of time constraints, we had a very, very packed agenda. We did ask to defer that to the June meeting. Oops, what happened to the rest of my calendar? At the June meeting, we had a couple of other items that were presented to you. I'm not sure what happened to my slide. It was in there. That were discussed, and then there were 2 additional items: parking ratios per unit, as well as some zoning information and some other parking information. And the agenda item was moved to be on the council agenda in August, thank you, and then it was deferred back to work session. So I'm not sure what happened to my PowerPoint. I'm not going to go through every single one of the items, but in the packet is the PowerPoint presentation as well as the text amendment that was initiated, and then we also have the additional slides of the information that were requested by council during our committee meetings. Essentially, the bulk of what we initially brought forward was to consider moving some of the definitions that were in various places throughout the text and putting them all into one location within Article 2, which is our definitions that apply throughout the UDC. Many of these were either in Article 14 definitions, or they were in later sections immediately after this, or in the same, just different paragraphs later on in Article 2. And so we brought them all together rather than referring back and forth to each other. Expanding the definition of lot frontage, as well as bringing forward a clear definition of front property line, rear property line, and what a corner lot is, all in the same location with definition of lot. And then for building setbacks, the same thing. There wasn't actually a definition provided here in Article 2, so we brought that forward, and then made some more clear definitions of what those setbacks were. For example, originally, the document referred to a primary street or a side street rather than a front and a side and a rear. And so in order to make the logic of a definition of a lot along with the definition of the lot of the setbacks, which are then carried throughout the tables that you'll find in the various articles specific to townhomes with those dimensions that have been set by council as to what those front setbacks, rear setbacks, et cetera, are. This was the recommendation that was brought forward to try and simplify that and make us use the same term throughout as opposed to switching back and forth between primary and front. Then, as I mentioned, getting into the setbacks, the actual measurement of those and how it's done, replacing that terminology to now reflect the same terminology throughout the document. We moved the definition of corner lot up to lot, so it's no longer going to be here in setbacks, which is kind of an odd location for it anyway. And then rear setback again, making sure that we use terminology that makes sense, that's carried on throughout the document, and then removing things that either cause confusion or in other locations now. Same thing with how to measure the actual setbacks on corner lots, and then if there are lots where all lot lines that are not the front or the rear or a side street are going to be side interior. So we tried to also make that, because the side that has a road as a side frontage would have a different setback than a side interior. This was just an update that we don't refer to it in the code as a landscape buffer anymore. It's a neighborhood compatibility buffer, and just to avoid confusion, we noticed that and went ahead and made that recommendation. This is just a renumbering of the letters based on the other changes. And then for parking, this is another thing that we were asked to bring forward and look at. This is getting into whether we're referring to townhouses. There's a component regarding rear-loaded townhouses where the garage doors are on the back side of the building, and then those that are front-loaded. And by backside, I mean there's a front door facing a street or some other space, and then the rear of the building is where the garage door is, and front-loaded, the front door and the garage door are on the same side of the building. And so again, updating the definitions, one of the things that we found to be very confusing is we referred to alley, and when the document was put together originally, alley just referred to anything that was in the back of the building, but we have a typical section called an alley, and we wanted to make sure that we avoided any confusion between those, so we referred to it as an access right-of-way or access easement as opposed to an alley, just to not confuse it with the definition when it comes to the typical section, because it's not the same. And then this is where the distance is regarding the garage door, and the distance from the property line or that easement line to that garage door face were discussed. This is something that council did ask us to come back to. I'm going to get to that in just a moment. The very next section is the front loaded, so the same thing, looking at the dimensions of the garage door from that front property line. There is the administrative alternative finding, which we spent a lot of time talking about. One of the things that we wanted to make sure is very clear is this is only specific to the garage door width. It's not to anything else. So this was a place where we wanted to make that very clear. And then the residential parking location, so this is the parking in the front setback. One of the things that is not a problem just for townhouses, but it is for pretty much any single family house, is that if you do have a garage, it's in the front of the house, or even honestly one that goes around to the side of the house. If you have a narrow lot, the combined parking and driveway constituting less than 40% between the front of the building and the property line can actually be problematic depending on the size of that, because if you have a narrow lot and a front garage, that garage may be half of the width of your lot, and that certainly is the case in a townhome, regardless of the width of your driveway, because we have units as small as 20 feet, and you have to have a driveway a minimum of 12 feet wide. So you automatically create a conflict with the code. So our recommendation is to eliminate the section in the code that refers to that, because we have driveway standards that you've adopted in the construction specifications that give the driveway widths, and that is that you have to have a 12-foot minimum width for a single driveway, and then the maximum would be allowed for 24. So this would be going up to a double garage door, for example. And then the removing the garage door setback 20 feet from this line item, because we're covering that in other sections of the code. This is just a reminder that you have to have enough front setback that a car parked in the driveway doesn't encroach into the sidewalk. I'm sorry, you know what, let me get out of here. Something's happened to this PowerPoint. It's missing
Pages.
a lot of pages, like all the tables that I was just referring to. So bear with me. Well, and I have the PDF of the whole thing. My apologies, that's the presentation I gave you in June. All right, so here we go. So you had asked us to look at the parking and dimensions from the front right-of-way line or rear right-of-way line, regardless of the situation, to the garage door. This is the table that was presented to you at committee that shows what other jurisdictions, these are similar ones that we had picked around when we were looking at a lot of these definitions and the research that had been done over the past probably 18 months, 2 years in talking about this. So as you can see, Roswell has a 4-foot minimum, 20-foot 4 or 20 minimum, and as we talked about before, that difference was that either you cannot park a car or you can park a car. If it was 4 feet, the idea behind that number is that a car is not able to park in 4 feet because you can't park across the sidewalk, and then the 20-foot would be a couple of feet more than a standard parking space, and so therefore, even if you're a terrible parker, you should be able to get your car within the 20 feet and not be encroaching into the sidewalk. The other jurisdictions all have something very similar, anywhere from 5 instead of 4. Some don't allow that smaller size. They only do 20 feet. Depending on the choice that is made here, it then does impact some of our setback information. So for example, if we said that you have to have 20 period, end of story, if there's any place where we allow a building setback of less than 20 feet, and that garage could be on that side, then we would have to make that setback now 20 feet, which is not a problem. It's just a number we need to make sure that we carry through those tables that are in all the different sections of the code. And I was going to stop here because I know this was one of the things that we've talked about a lot, and see if there are any questions about anything to this point.
Council, any questions?
So
as I look at this list, because again, as I've stressed in the past, that even with it being 4 feet and it being against the law to park covering the sidewalk or into the street, it's still typical that it's going to happen, and setting ourselves up for complaints later on and frustration from both the resident as well as, both the resident that lives there as well as the ones calling code enforcement or the police, et cetera. So as I look at this list, although there's some that are somewhat similar with Roswell, if you actually look at just the nearby Georgia ones, almost all of them address this better than in Roswell. So as I'm looking at all the Georgia ones, there's Alpharetta, there's Marietta, Sandy Springs, and I thought I saw one other, Peachtree City. So they all have, all of them except for one, just have a plain old 18 or 20 foot minimum, period. And then the only one that is more aggressive than those ones is, all the others, is Sandy Springs, and even still, that's an additional 2 feet minimum on top of Roswell. So I think seeing that, I think it's pretty clear that we do need to address it. And again, you know, as I look at the development going on in Alpharetta, it does seem to me that they have frankly some better planning and better products than we've seen here from different you know, some different projects and different feedback we've seen from residents, et cetera. So that's where I think we absolutely should be changing this and really lining up better with Alpharetta and other neighboring cities.
Well, and I'd also like to comment on that. I've made this comment before in previous meetings, which is we're setting up an enforcement nightmare.
Right.
My first question is, who enforces it? Is it code enforcement or is it the police department? I guess that depends on maybe private property, and then the police are not going to enforce anything on private property. So, and, you know, I've got a neighboring new development that has the 4-foot driveways, and trust me, people park in them, and their cars hang out into the private road, and they don't seem to have a problem with it themselves. So I have an issue with that. I think it needs to be, the driveway needs to be at least the length of a car, with excluding the sidewalk. That just only makes sense to me, so that would be what I'd support. Additional comments from council?
And so I agree with that. And just to clarify, because I saw earlier where you took out the feet, is just the length of a car might not be clear to different developers, because some developer might want to say it's the length of, if it's a smart car, versus what about the residents that are driving an F-150?
Sure, and that, yeah, sure. And that's where the 20 feet comes from, because a standard parking space is only 18 feet deep. In a standard, I mean, even though a extended cab might not quite fit in an 18-foot parking space, generally speaking, the 18-foot parking space accommodates all vehicles, so the 20, the idea was that it would be ample for that.
So 18 feet covers SUVs?
Correct.
Like an Escalade, let's just say an Escalade. That covers that? Okay.
I haven't measured one recently, but my understanding is that is the case. And in answer to your enforcement question, if I may, if it's during the daytime and a call were to come in that a vehicle is blocking a sidewalk, that would be something that code enforcement would address. If it were after hours or on the weekend, it would be a police enforcement, just because we don't have staffing that work after hours.
So our police department would be acting as code enforcement officers?
They do that today if there is a code
Yes,
violation.
I understand
Correct.
that.
Yes, that is correct. Yes, ma'am.
Which makes it very difficult to enforce. Yes,
I just have a code enforcement clarifying question. I've reported code enforcement issues over the weekend, and I understand that we don't enforce code over the weekend.
We do enforce code over the weekend. If a phone call goes to the police department that someone is violating the code, they are supposed to respond to it, is my understanding. We don't have staffing on the weekend.
Okay, so I should report code issues to the police department over the weekend.
Correct.
I wasn't clear on that.
Yeah, that would be
Thank you.
if it's a violation like that. Now, I'm not the chief of police, so I don't tell them who does what, but my understanding is if a report of a code violation comes in, then the non-emergency police number is the one who would take that call and respond to it appropriately.
Okay, sorry for bothering you on the
No,
weekends.
it's fine. Well, they are a repeat offender, and so it is great that you notify us, and we immediately were out there and we are taking action, so. The car was gone, but We're taking action because we have a picture.
And I would like to point out in the past that we have required that code enforcement be available on weekends for certain hours, because that's when most of these code violations occur. So are we not rotating code enforcement throughout the weekends anymore?
We are not. When we brought that in-house, that was not something that we proposed to provide as a service.
Okay.
That was something that was an add-on that we asked Safe Built to do as a part of, participating in outside of normal business hour activities. There were HOA meetings, some other things that they were tasked as an extra scope item to do. We have asked to add another person. Originally, it was part-time, in order to have somebody who works a flex schedule and address weekend issues, Saturdays in particular. And that's just not something we've been able to get through the budget over the past few years, so we certainly are interested in that. The staffing that we proposed, when we brought that in-house, did not account for the Saturday work with the number of people that we brought in, and the workload of the calls that we get currently.
Well, I feel a little bit like we're going backwards, because before we went outside of the house, we had flex schedules for code enforcement, and it covered weekends.
And it was not considered.
Then we went out of house, and that wasn't included. We come back in-house and it's not included. So we had a service for our residents that 15 years ago that we don't now, and I find that a little troubling. So I think that that's something that we need to look at in the future. Because I can tell you right now, our police officers, and rightly so, are not focused on code enforcement issues, period.
Yes, I know. I hate to
They're
call it
just, and by the way, because I know dealing with like noise complaints, they actually get a little perturbed because they feel as though they should be doing police activities, not code enforcement activities. So, and I'm not saying anything disparaging about our police officers, but they were sworn in to do a certain job, and code enforcement was not one of those. So I think we really need to look at it. And I think that should be a topic going forward, separate line item here. Additional, yes.
Yes, thanks. I don't have any problem with the 20-foot setback minimum, and taking out the 4. I do have a question how this compares to single-family residential driveway requirements. Is this equivalent to? And if it's less than, how much less than? Because I imagine we have the same parking problems.
The single-family residential is going to be based on the front building setback. We don't, in Article 2, it's just that you have to park on a hard surface in the front. There isn't anything specific to single-family houses and the driveway garage issue. It's more about which way the garage faces is what we cover in Article 2. So when you go to Article 3, in the residential, for example, it's going to be based on the front setback. So for example, if we're talking about an RS30, it's a 60 or 50-foot setback, and so those dimensions don't become an issue. And the smaller lots, that might be, and I don't know, I can't recall
The smallest one here, that's 35, here we go. The smallest setback is 30 feet. No, that's a lot less, sorry. 15. So the small setback is 15.
Yeah, so that's where we would go through and make sure that whatever minimum is decided here, we need to make sure we don't have any front setback that is less than that. Whether it's the townhouses or the single family, I believe it would just be probably the RS9, RS6, those smaller lots are the ones that would be an issue to be covered.
So I think it's good discussion, and actually, probably the most productive conversation we've had in all the times we've discussed this townhouse stuff. So, given, I believe I'm hearing, please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm hearing a lot of consensus on changing the garage setback to 20 feet, and looking at it, making sure both for townhomes as well as for single-family homes. Is this something that is clear enough for staff where we're able to actually make progress on this and move this portion forward? Because I think there's definitely some very confusing, more convoluted type aspects in in this whole townhome discussion, but this one seems to me pretty cut and dry, and I completely agree with the mayor that the last thing I want to do is not set up our code enforcement or our police up for success. And I think by correcting this to 20 feet, we're really setting them up for success, and leaving it as is, we're certainly not setting them up for success in the future.
we're good on this one. So I will continue on to the rest of it. That's the location. So and we may need to go back to some of those areas. All of the definitions that we have presented to you so far in the articles, 3.29, 4.35, 5.37, 6.32, as well as any of the single family, now that we've made a decision about the 20-foot for that garage minimum, we would check to make sure we don't have any building setbacks that needs to be carried through. So that is not tracked in this, since that's information feedback that we're getting. There would not be any changes. So this is in the article when you go into the specific zoning category and then look at the setback requirements. It's going to give you your lot sizes, your lot width, setbacks, et cetera. So there would be no changes on this first section where the definition of lot is. This all would line up with the terms that are used in the definitions we've talked about so far. And then under placement, we would want to make sure whatever terms are used here are the ones we've agreed to in the other section. So for example, if front is the chosen term instead of primary street, we want to make sure that's carried through. This is something where we would have to make an adjustment. And so the 10-foot for A, primary for front, if this were a front-loaded townhome, 10-foot won't work. It needs to be 20 feet to have that minimum. So the 10 would be your minimum, but if it's a front-loaded townhome, 20 feet is going to be the setback based on that garage definition that we're defining the 20-foot from the property line. And then if, right now, this says for rear is 4 or 20. So again, that 4 would go away. It would just be 20 would be the number that would be there. So those are adjustments that we would need to carry through on all of these. Does that make sense so far? Okay. And then there would be no change in the scale. And then this is where there was a definition expansion for the pedestrian access. If you're allowed to have front facing either street or a civic space, you'd want to make sure that the front door can also face either of those. And then that is, those same things that we just reviewed on those past 4 slides are carried through all the other sections, which I wasn't going to take the time to go through, unless there's any questions about those. And then we can go to the other questions that were raised to us. Which is, this one. Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to get back to a terminology question.
Sure.
And the term is civic space.
Okay.
Can we go back and revisit that? Because civic is, really means city or town or administration. And I'm afraid that it's going to be confused with our civic zoning.
So where we got that terminology from was we were asked to look at how other jurisdictions refer to it. And so the city of Alpharetta, I believe, is where we copied that language from, if I'm not mistaken. I would have to find, it might be Sandy Springs, I'd have to find the ordinance in my notes of what we had. And so that was one of the fronts that they had, was a civic space usable for civic purposes, including not limited to. They had a much longer list than we did. So park, square, plaza, pocket park, playground, common area, or open space. Common area and open space were 2 terms that are commonly used throughout the document for required spaces they have to have, which are probably the 2 most commonly used that staff would see being recommended as a civic space for it to front. So we define civic space here under E, lot frontage, for that to be carried through. And I thought we also had, I can't remember now if it's here or in the front part, so let me just check.
Would it be defined in the definitions? Are you adding a definition for it in the back?
We could, if that's what we want to do, to make sure that it's limited to that, because of course, we've got, including but not limited to, this was the recommendation that we brought forward based on what staff was asked to find, for flexibility of what that definition could be. And, let me see if I have it in here to tell you where we found that from. I don't know if I have a hard copy. See where that definition came from, but we pulled that from another code that allows their townhomes to face a green space. I believe it was Alpharetta, but it might have been Sandy Springs. I apologize, I don't have it. It's been
And so,
a couple months since I looked at it.
can I? Go ahead. So just back, I'm really kind of stuck on this one. Why do we add cottage court in this language if this is just, if this is the townhouse?
This is not for townhouse, this is for a definition of lot. So Article 2 is definitions that carry through the entire code. And so in this particular case, every lot, whether it's a townhouse, a single-family house, or whatever, if it's a single lot, this would be how we're defining it. The problem with the cottage court is that the way that it's defined is it's going to be a space of land with a shared driveway. Some of the lots may front a street itself because there's a street frontage on the property as a whole. So we'll call that the site. So there's the site that is being turned into a cottage court. There's a access driveway, and the graphic that is shown in the UDC has that driveway essentially down the middle of the property with the cottage courts and kind of a horseshoe around that. So you have two that are facing the street, and then the other 3 or 4 units are actually facing this shared driveway, which is why it's called a cottage court. We've also seen where sometimes those pieces of property have multiple street frontages. And so the way the definition is for cottage court, which I don't have on the slide, so let me see if I can pull it up in the UDC while we're talking about it. I think I can get to it through here. It's faster when I'm on my computer.
Yeah, Sarah,
Okay.
it's letter D.
Carriage. Okay, so for cottage court, the graphic that's here in the middle of the screen, this is roadway frontage. The shared access is here. Now, they actually are showing driveway around to garage, driveway around to garage, and then this is the courtyard. I shouldn't say access. This is the courtyard in the middle. So they're actually doing a driveway like this, a driveway like this, and then this is the front of this building. This is the front of this one. This is the front of this one. It's facing the courtyard. So it, by definition, does not have frontage on a street of any kind. So when the use of cottage court as a building type was put in here, there had to be some sort of a description to show how that was going to be complying with the definition of lot when a lot is supposed to have frontage on a primary street. And it didn't. So instead, it has to have a facing on some sort of common space. And that could be either a courtyard like this or a combination of a courtyard and driveway access is another way that it's been shown. So we left that alone. We did not make any adjustments to that, but wanted to add, due to the request by at least one person, to look for flexibility of having a townhouse be able to face something other than a street. Because by definition, for lot, it had to face, and it's not here, it had to be have frontage. The front property line, by definition, is contiguous with the right-of-way, the roadway. And so thereby, it does not allow for a townhouse to face anything other than a street
So,
in the code today.
everything. So, in the code today, I guess I thought that we were allowed to, or permitted to, build townhouse that faced, that faced a green space.
No, that's why we're here.
So we are not,
Nope. So there was a change made in the code a number of years ago to lot frontage, which is letter E on the screen. That was changed to say every lot must have frontage upon a public street, private street built to public standards, or specified courtyard for cottage court. There used to be a statement at the end of that definition that said a rear-loaded townhome could count an alley as its frontage.
Okay.
That was added supposedly in order to allow a townhome to face a green space. The problem is that the term lot frontage doesn't apply to any of those tables that we've been looking at where you talk about measurements for setbacks. And so that term is not interchangeable with front lot line. And so that term was, that section of the definition was deleted in the past 18 months or so, maybe 2 years, which makes,
Okay, so instead of doing a lot of changes, can we just not correct the definition of lot frontage?
we don't want that. Lot frontage does not help. We need it to be lot line front. Because we measure setbacks from lot line front, not from lot frontage. Because lot frontage just means you have to have one of your lines on your property has to be on a road. But that could be more than one road.
So is there an opportunity, I guess what I'm asking, is there an opportunity to refine just one simple definition that, instead of making all of these changes, that's all?
That's what we originally brought to council, was just changing the definitions, period. We didn't change anything else. And that was to change, the confusion is that there's a lot frontage. And the idea there was we didn't want flag lots. We didn't want landlocked lots. We wanted to make sure that every lot had a correct amount of frontage on a public street or private street. And avoid we have a number of parcels that don't have that. They're landlocked, and so it creates an issue. And so that was something that was added in as a definition before the UDC. I think it was actually before, it's been the zoning code for a while. So that lot frontage is just to say you have access to a roadway. And then we start talking about the definitions for front setback, side setback, rear setback, and you have to have defined property lines in order to do those measurements from. So the front property line, and the rear property line, and then the sides would be those 4 definitions. The problem with townhomes is that if you have a front-loaded townhome, your front and your garage are both off of a street. So it's easy. When it's a rear-loaded townhome, the way the definitions are today, you would have a street in the front and a street in the back of every townhome building. So the idea was, let's take away that need for the street in the front to allow for a townhome per code to have the flexibility to face a green space the way that a lot of them have been built, because they were built using the definition of lot frontage incorrectly, which is what was brought to staff's attention and why this whole process started. Was to clean up those definitions.
So with so many different changes here and to the point, so, I think this is a great illustration of it. So if we look to we brought up an issue, I believe it was the mayor that brought it up, which again, there was consensus around, which is we're creating a negative experience for residents and an enforcement nightmare regarding the driveways. And so we looked at other Georgia cities and see, okay, right off the bat, 20 feet makes a lot more sense than 4 feet. And so that's an issue that we're solving, and it's very clear to me on what that impact is. The impact is a developer that wants to develop new townhomes can't just do 4-foot driveways to just, pack everything in and then have cars that can't fit in the driveway. So that's a change I believe there's consensus on. I think it's very clear to all of us kind of why it's needed. My concern with some of this other stuff is you mentioned that there was one official that wanted the flexibility of being able to have the front not facing the public road, which sounds great. I love flexibility and that sounds interesting. However, what that results in is the potential of neighbors across the street, next door, et cetera, all staring at a lot of very large garages. That I think is not the intent that was created within the code. So that's where I still think for a lot more of of these bigger changes and just more changes, that's where I think we do need just more discussion and more importantly, taking a step back and say, okay, what is it that we want? And then how do we, or what's an issue, and then how do we solve it, and then what do we see as that impact? And I had thought, I could be wrong, I thought for this item, we had discussing with Planning Commission on kind of just looking at that big picture. I could be off on that, but either way, I'm just really concerned that we make some changes that all seem reasonable with this, but it ends up creating a townhouse product that both current and future residents of Roswell don't see as the best way to complement the character of our city. And so that's where I have the concerns with this many changes without fully understanding the exact issues and exact needs.
Yes, I think the reason that we're having this conversation, I think, is just so that we improve the quality and the flexibility of the choices of the residential communities that we have. And I think that if you look at, and give us the flexibility to design the best possible product, is what we all should be looking at.
And so I think, I am glad that it sounds like our intent is certainly aligned where our goal is to have the best quality product for the current and future residents of Roswell. That being said, I'm concerned without fully understanding the exact impact and examples and scenarios of what some of these changes could lead to. I'm concerned would result in something that does not end up being the ideal product. With that flexibility that I'm hearing be described, that's something where I think it could make sense for it to be a variance request or some type of request where the public has the opportunity to see it that way, or if someone's going in for a rezoning, the opportunity for them to give that additional request. But my concern of just having it here by just a part of the code, we're opening ourselves up to something that sounds great potentially in some scenarios that we can think of, but I'm really concerned for those scenarios we cannot think of.
And this was something that was brought up by Mr. Schumacher, who we met with, as far as the intent statement.
And I will be calling on him when council's done.
Okay, okay, good. I just wanted to ask if we're adding an intent statement. That was it.
Where specifically are you referring to?
As in 2.2-19, the residential garage parking.
There was not a plan to do that. There's not intent statements usually provided in Article 2. They're definitions. Intent statements fall into some of the other sections. If that's something that you want to have added, we certainly could. Usually it's applicability and definitions that are included in this article, are not. The intent statements are more about the character areas and the zonings that are in the other articles 3 through 8, whatever. I always lose track of the numbers. We could if that's something that appears to be missing, but that's just not the typical format when you're referring to definitions, because we want it to be a definition, not an intent. We want it to be very clear.
Okay, and just when we met over this a couple of times, I thought that was perhaps the reason that led to some of the confusion was the lack of an intent statement. So staff didn't know or couldn't interpret some of the.
Yeah, so I don't recall that. I apologize. This is all of the recommendations that are included in here are all generated from those meetings that we had and the conversations that we had. The intent statement, I don't recall talking about that, so I apologize. That was like in January that we had those conversations, so it has been a while, and I just don't recall that. Again, if there is a need for that, the definitions in Article 2.2, it's what is there is what we are able to enforce. If there's an intent, the intent is more about look and feel and guideline kind of stuff that you would put, for example, in the RTH townhome intent statement when you get to Article 3. It's not something that I think we want in definitions, and I maybe would defer to Davidson just to say, the title of Article 2 is define terms that are used, I think that's what it is, throughout the document. They're applicable throughout the document. So I don't know if it's appropriate to have an intent statement when we're providing definitions. So that's more of a legal term.
So the intent would go basically towards if somebody was suing us, our defense would be, well, it says the intent is right here. It wouldn't be with the definition like Lenore said, because the definition is basically what they're enforcing. So if somebody's coming in for a rezoning, you want to know the intent of that zoning category, then the council could say, no, that doesn't fall under the intent. That's not a reason to deny it. That's just one of the reasons that we would use as defense when somebody sued for not getting a rezoning. So it wouldn't be appropriate in a definition portion of it.
But it might be appropriate, maybe I just have the wrong section for it,
Right.
because it's part of Code Studio and it's in a lot of other areas, so.
Right, yeah, it's absolutely, it'd be good to put in places just to show your intent
Yeah, I just,
for what you're looking for, and it helps when they're interpreting something in the code.
yeah, I think it
Well,
would be
here's
helpful,
council's intent, this is how we're interpreting it.
because I've been doing on-the-job training here on this stuff, and an intent statement would have been great. All right. Okay, thank you.
Additional comments from council? Is there anyone in the public that would like to come forward and speak? Yes, sir, please come forward. You can come up here and sit at a microphone if you don't mind, Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you. So quickly on the intent, we do have in the garage door ordinance, down in the administrative alternate finding, it does refer to an intent. The approved alternate meets the remaining intent of the garage door option regulation. So Code Studio did sell us a package. That package did have an intent in it. Some of the other cities that bought the same package do have the intent in this section. I think it would be very helpful to include that and have provided it previously. So I think, I understand what you're saying, Mr. Davidson, about that, but I think having a clear communication on why we want to restrict the width of garage doors for some building types, and would certainly help ComDev make any adjustments to those definitions, as well as perhaps what would happen in BZA if it came up. Back to front property line, I'm a little concerned about the language here because I'm not really sure how many building types this would apply to, and who would define whether a space was a civic space or not. We do know that things like common area and open space can be very small, only maybe a couple feet wide. So in this case, does this definition of front property line open it up so that any lot can be turned around at the convenience of the property owner? And would it also apply to single-family residences, commercial buildings and such, where, a property owner may say, well, it would be an advantage to me to face, my neighbor on my side instead of facing the street. I believe that this definition here, the main intent is to do townhouses where we have garage doors covering the entire front. Today, I know that Lenore believes that the code today doesn't permit townhouses facing a green space, but they do. There's nothing to prevent anybody from building a facade on the rear of their building that's actually facing a green space. We can do that today. The restriction is that we don't want to have the entire front of the building at the street, all garage doors and no front doors. And so this front property line definition is really designed to be able to turn a lot around. And I worry about that happening because we do allow things in our rear yards. So if we do allow people to turn our properties around in unknown directions, we may end up with things like swimming pools at the road, because that would then be permitted if that was a backyard essentially facing the road. So can I understand who would be defining civic space in this definition?
This body would do that. We've made a recommendation of one based on another code that we copied from, but it would be people sitting around this table who would make that definition and adopt it.
So your idea might be, hypothetically, that a property owner would come and say, I would like to make this 4-foot square in the middle of my lot civic space, and then I would perhaps deed that to the city and as civic space?
No,
Or
so
would
the-
just call it civic space?
Right, no, so the definition of a civic space that we have currently recommended and brought forward for consideration is a park, square, plaza, pocket park, playground, common area, open space. And there are common areas and open spaces that are required for specific development categories. And so that's where we actually added that because it was not in some of the definitions that we found and how, this was how, I believe it was Alpharetta was allowing for one of the townhome units that we were looking at to have their front doors go out onto a common open area, and then they have one single road that's behind the building, and that's where the garage doors are. And so this was a stab at a definition that we brought forward as something that we thought would make sense. This does not say that a house could face another house on another property, because it would, they would have to have defined that common area around that, and that would be something we would have to take a look at, and that may be what we need to do, but the common areas and the open spaces that are affiliated with single-family tend to be different than they are for the townhouses, because it's not the same percentages that are there. But that is something that we would consider. What's interesting with the single-family houses is we don't have a rear-loaded and front-loaded option. What you're raising is a good question and something we need to take a look at from a lot setback perspective for those zoning classifications, and how those definitions are. And that means that definition is something that needs to be decided by this body of what do you want it to face? And if it is something that has to be very specifically designed in a townhouse development with a very specific name and some percentage associated with it, then that would be what that definition is. One of the ones that, as an example, that we have looked at together, and it's the one that Mayor Henry's talked about with the parking, is that their common open space does surround the buildings. And so we've got situations there where it may look like the building is facing the road, but there's actually HOA common space between the road and the property line for that townhome. So there's all sorts of options and scenarios that could come forward that may be something to be considered. We've got other ones where it faces an open space that's associated with underground stormwater detention, and so they basically have a huge green lawn, and their garage doors are off the back, but their front doors are going out to this common sidewalk, and then they're facing what is actually a common green space with a dog walk and all that sort of thing. So there are lots of examples out there of what is being done. Technically, the definitions that are in the code today can be varied, so through a variance process, a townhome today could have its front door on a green space and its garage door as a rear-loaded off of a street, but it would be through a variance process because of the way the definitions are today in the code with the limitations that are on them.
Okay, I have a couple of other questions. So I wasn't really clear on the discussion around 20 feet for the driveway, because in their code changes, it says 4 feet still.
Correct, so that's a decision that was just presented to us today as a decision that we are hearing that they would prefer to have 20 only and not the 4 or 20. That decision was not decided upon until today.
And you did eliminate setting that at the back side of the sidewalk, though.
Correct, we used property lines instead of sidewalk because the sidewalk can vary where it is in the property line, so we wanted to use something that would be common across all properties and use the property line instead of the sidewalk.
And so from our conversations, that could actually mean that the driveway is sort of bisected by a sidewalk. Because
No.
sidewalks are sometimes on the property.
No. Because what we also have in there is if the sidewalk is on an easement, then it would be from the easement line. It would not be from the property line. We have both of those in there. So they would have to have the 20 feet would not include the sidewalk. So our standard typical section is that the sidewalk is in the public right-of-way and not on the private property, and the measurement would be entirely within the private property. If there's a circumstance where transportation needs to allow for a sidewalk in a permanent easement that is on that private property, then that would be handled based on that easement line, not on the property line, in order to make sure that minimum is provided.
Okay. One more, I guess, comment, question. So really, many of these changes are simply around supporting townhouses, more or less facing a green space or not having their front facade facing the street. Wouldn't it simply be easier to increase the width of a potential garage door for townhouses in certain circumstances, rather than trying to reorient setbacks and front lot lines and rear lot lines and such?
So there's two different issues. There is the width issue, but we've actually not necessarily addressed that in this case. If it's going to be a front-loaded townhome, that maximum width of the 50%, if I remember my numbers right, is still there. And so that would still have to go through the administrative variance process. This is purely, the conversation is largely centered around what are we going to call where's the front door got to face? And what are the options for where garage doors can face on a townhome building with these definitions? And then, of course, looking at the driveway length and the preference for that. So there isn't any modification to how wide of a garage door will be allowed on a townhome unit. And that was not something that staff was asked to change.
Thank you.
Additional comments from council? Yes.
So basically, we are ending up with, we would like the 20-foot, we've clarified the 20-foot driveway, and we would like developers to be able to orient their townhomes either on a green, or facing a green, or not. And this is a question, as far as the pedestrian access, that is required on a street, is that still correct?
Right now, the recommendation would be, it would also refer to the civic space. So there's the same thing with the lot definition, that the lot front would be either road, cottage court, or civic space. Those same three options would also be available for the front door from a pedestrian access perspective in the recommendation that we brought forward. And I'm not sure that everybody has settled on those definitions,
So could
from what I'm hearing.
So could we not still require the pedestrian access to the street? And if they want a secondary pedestrian access, they certainly could do that?
Yes, the definition of it's pedestrian access, and it says entrance facing primary street. This one is not the right one. Let me go.
Go to, either 3 or 4.
Oh, no, I do have it right. Primary street or civic space. So, bear with me.
So
Okay.
if you just left it as entrance facing primary street,
Then they would have to have a garage door and a pedestrian door on that unit. And so the minimum width that we have for a unit would not accommodate a two-car garage and a pedestrian door.
So
For a point of reference,
Okay.
that would be where there would be a narrow unit would have a smaller garage door to be able to provide both of those and go with the minimum, because we require a minimum of a 20-foot unit.
okay, so that's their choice, you know?
Yep, and that is something we can
And
take
that
out.
gets rid of that confusion, and then they can certainly add a pedestrian access to the other side. Okay, thank you.
Additional comments from council? Do you have the guidance that you need?
I'm not sure. Let me run through really quickly a number of quick things just to make sure, because I'm hearing not to mess with a lot of the definitions, but that's the whole reason we started this, was the confusion of the definitions and putting them on the same location. So I guess I'd like to first start with, is there any opposition to relocating the definitions from Article 14 into 2 to put them all together in a sequential order? Most of them are the exact same wording, and then we'd also talk about the modifications to those. I guess first is that something that this body is comfortable with us moving forward with?
Yes.
define, in the packet, under defined terms, you're removing some defined terms. I would think that we would want to leave those defined terms and add to those defined terms in section 14.2.
So our recommendation is not to have them in both locations in case you change anything, which is what's actually caused some problems. So because we have Article 2, which the title of it is rules applicable to all districts. And this is where we have all these definitions that we're referring to that are applicable to all districts. Right now, some of those are in Article 2, and some of them are in the defined definitions. But not everybody who's using these goes to both locations. And so it has created a lot of that confusion and back and forth. And so our suggestion was, let's put them all in the same location. We can duplicate them and have them in both locations.
What if they were just all in defined terms?
There are some of these that have to be in the rules of how they apply across, because of the way the terminology is my understanding. So for simplicity, and because of the fact that we had to flip through so many different pages, whether it was us or developer or someone who's come in and talked to us about it, that was the recommendation from staff. We can put them wherever you guys prefer.
I guess the only two questions that I hear about is lot frontage and lot line front.
Right, so,
I mean, if we just fix those, define those, would that solve? If we change lot line front to be the front property line coincident with the primary street right-of-way line versus what it is, and then define the lot frontage, then you could leave your terminology in your other sections and use those terms correct, not that they were being done incorrectly, but then it's more clear because you can go in the definition and look it up, and there it is.
we can do it both locations, that's fine. I do recommend that we have everything in this article, because if I've got a definition that's in the back, for example, lot line front was in the back, but yet we refer to lot frontage and property lines from a measurement perspective, and we don't refer to it as a lot line front anywhere else in the code except for in Article 14. Everywhere else, when we talk about what the lot line front is, it's primary street. So what we wanted to recommend was.
But in the definition, just excuse me, it says with a street, not a primary street.
I understand, but when you go to all the other sections of the code, we don't say lot line front, we say primary street. We don't use the term lot line front, so we were trying to consolidate all of them into the same location. So I think having in both locations, if that's what council wants, that is not a problem. We can absolutely do that. We can make sure that the definitions, as long as we make sure they match, they can be in both locations. I think the idea is that the defined terms is the definition of the word that's being used. Article 2 is how those terms apply to the zoning districts throughout the document, and how they apply and what the definition are not necessarily one and the same, and we just want to make sure that they are clear and consistent. So I think that we can do that. That's not a problem to have them in both locations.
I'd like to see them in both locations.
Okay.
Because
That's fine.
definitions
We
is
can do that.
someplace.
And then the definition of civic space, I don't know that we have settled on what we recommended. I know there were some questions and concerns about that. I just want to understand what this council would like for us to do regarding that definition.
Councilmember Palermo.
So I'd say, certainly there was consensus on the driveway item. I'm also comfortable with Councilmember Hall's suggestion of just putting the definitions in both places, because it sounds like it's in one place today. Staff wants it to be in a different place, and so I think it definitely makes sense to bring it over to the definition place as well. But as for any of the changes that potentially impact the rules on how townhomes are developed, I'd say I'm not comfortable with those changes. So for example, to your point, with civic space, the fact that we don't have it defined, it's not clear to me what that would look like, as well as, for properties that are already entitled to townhomes. So from those standpoints, again, that's where I really would prefer looking at it differently and saying, what is it we want to accomplish, and then understanding the benefits as well as the risks, because I think I did hear some benefits potentially to making some changes, but I want to make sure we're looking at it from all angles to make sure that we're not doing the opposite of our intent, which is making sure we have the highest quality product for our residents.
I still don't have a definition for civic. Do we want to remove that? Because if I don't have a definition, I don't have something to bring forward to you in whatever next step you're gonna tell me to take, Mary.
And I'm confused, because I thought civic is not currently in there, that was an addition.
This is an addition, so this is the recommended definition that
Right.
staff brought forward from the city of Alpharetta's code, where they have, how they allow for townhomes to front a green space. This is how they do it.
And my point is, that's something I'm not comfortable with yet, because we haven't discussed the full potential impact. So that's where I'm saying, I certainly support what Councilmember Hall was saying of staff wants to move the definitions for more clarity, and that makes sense. But anything that's changing the rules without really understanding the potential benefits and risks, that's something where I don't feel we should be moving forward yet.
So we're basically going to eliminate all of the changes with the exception of making sure that, if there's any definition that's missing, we'll make sure that it's included, and we'll be removing the 4-foot from the driveway width. My understanding from what I'm hearing is none of these other changes to the definitions are supported.
These changes that are,
Correct.
Correct.
I thought we were trying to get a highest quality product possible. You know, maybe we need to load everybody up in a bus and go ride around and look at some projects in Alpharetta and Roswell and actually see how these come into play, into practice.
I actually think that's a great idea. Both, to look for ones that are successful and ones that we feel are low-quality product. But
I know, I mean.
that's where, to be clear, I'm not saying that I'm fully opposed to this. What I'm saying is, I don't feel we all fully understand the potential impacts. And that's where I'm not comfortable making the change until we are really seeing, all right, how are developers gonna use this, and what is the potential impact to the city of Roswell? And I totally agree, looking at neighbors is a good way to do that as well.
Well, let me try to clarify. I just want to make sure I'm understanding where council is. We have several items that we're ready to take forward to council. We've got other items that we're not prepared to move forward on, but we would like to continue to discuss them in committee. Is that correct? And it can include a field trip? And we can look at a lot of other options, so, but there are several items that we're ready to move forward to a council, and the others we'll keep in committee and move forward that way. Does everyone agree? Yes? Yes?
Clarifying question.
Yes? Was that a yes?
Can we add the intent statement wherever it's supposed to be, the one that came out of the code studio?
I'm not sure what that is.
It's,
I would suggest we hold that for future committee.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
I got a question for legal. I know this was on the council agenda in August, and then it was moved to come to a work session. I don't know, can they move it from a work session to a council meeting again?
We're going to
Or
committee.
go back to
We're going
committee
to committee.
first, and then you guys
We're going to
will move it?
committee, yeah.
Okay, I was just double checking. Thank you.
So my recommendation is we're actually going to bring the entire thing back to you at committee, because this was taken to council for initiation and sent back to here.
Right.
So my recommendation is, because I'm not 100% sure that everybody understands what we are and are not going to change, that we bring the track changes to committee again with ones that we have determined we want to move forward with. And what I'm hearing that comes out of it is definition of civic will be removed from all the places we've got it. We'll pull that aside just to make sure that it's very clear. Because again, the original versions we brought forward showed where this was and how it was moving around. And this definition has been in the last several presentations, so that feedback is very helpful for us to have. So we can take that out, bring those others in, and then restart the initiation process if that is acceptable.
Well, and what I would like to do is at least move part of this forward. because we seem to be getting stuck on the same issues over and over and over again. So let's just peel off the ones that we agree on, get those moving forward, and then we can have field trip after field trip on the remaining issues and work session after work session and committee meeting after committee meeting. So
And am I correct, David, that we would need to start back over in committee to retake it for initiation?
Except from a legal standpoint, I thought committee's not required, it's,
You know, any council member or
right. Any elected official could put it on a council
council.
agenda. Because I mean, I'm flexible either way, but to the mayor's point, I feel like there's so much here. I'd rather completely peel off the stuff that we have clear consensus for and are pretty straightforward, which is copying the definitions that already exist into a different location and changing the garage or the driveway piece. I'd prefer to just put that on a council meeting and have that completely removed so we can really then focus on what are these remaining items. Mayor, what are your thoughts on that?
I would prefer to go through the process. I'm not seeing that there's a burning issue here, and I think it would be clearer to the public if we go through the committee.
Are we able to have them as two separate items so that?
Oh,
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely, yes.
Because we won't
Clearly.
have time to get it, I'm sure.
And I think that'll help all of us.
I don't think we'll have field trip before then. A lot of separate items.
We are adjourned. Thank you.